Okay, finally, we're back. Hello. Welcome back to a casual chat with Rupert, August, Kurtz, Henry, and Simon. Apologies, I should say, for the delay. I won't discuss. We'll just move straight on. Today we're talking about...
that was one long week, wasn't it, boys?
Yeah, really drags on. Anyway, today we're talking about, as though nothing happened, social level nostalgia, because last time we talked about consumer nostalgia and sort of like personal nostalgia. So today we would, thought it'd be interesting to expand that out to greater social spheres and sort of how it affects things at the national and subcultural level, I suppose. Just on the off chance, anybody else got anything they'd like to say before I get us started? Didn't think so.
We're all pretty rusty. How about you kick this one off, Rupert?
Sure. So, a couple of things come to mind at first. So, for one thing, you've got movements like the Romanticist movement, or the Romantic movement, I should say, that were very deliberately and very overtly looking at things in like a nostalgic kind of way and trying to rekindle something of past glories, I suppose, or like try to revert away from modern trends that they disliked. And I think that taking that as a mold, there's a lot of different subcultures and sort of movements that try and do the same thing at various points in time. But the interesting thing is that they always seem to come up with something that's a little bit more synthetic of previous things, so they can never go back and like fully regain what was lost, because obviously you can't go back in time and you can't replicate the exact circumstances in which something sort of rose up. But having that nostalgia does have a very definite effect on on events, on thoughts, on how people sort of react to the world around them and how they perceive things around them. And I think that's probably something that is quite dominant on the right more generally than it is on the left, where the left tends to sort of look at things in more idealized forms and sort of compare against an idealized reality rather than comparing to an idealized version of the past. They're kind of distinct because, I don't know, if you're looking at a nostalgic vision of the past, then you're at least rooted to something, even if you can, twist that with various idealized forms.
Back in my day, we didn't have TikTok. We had to wait 60 minutes to load a 5-minute YouTube video.
We was happy.
And it made us a better generation, damn it.
Did it? Did it really?
Why are you going to do this to me, Rupert?
All right, I've thrown a lot of things out there on the table. Anybody want to pick up anything and run with it?
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that no one ever quite gets back to that the point that they're that they have nostalgia for. Like the Romantics were popping up in what would that be, like Victorian era, if I'm correct? And,
a little bit earlier than that, really. It's the if you imagine like the immediate post-Napoleonic period.
Right, yeah, and they were sort of more nostalgic for sort of what we would consider sort of like classical settings, like Rome and Greece, and like more chivalric periods in European history.
Yeah, more chivalric is definitely the thing that I would hover on. I think they were often trying to look very fondly at more medieval social situations, sort of thing.
Yeah, where I was going with that, with these, you never quite get back to where that nostalgia is lying. You can get close to emulating it, you can get close to almost mourning it in a way, but you never quite bring it back, even if you're in your best attempts. You can only emulate it because the simple fact of the matter is the world around you has changed, and it's no longer accommodating such a thing. A more recent example, I suppose, yeah, you could call this societal nostalgia, would be a lot of people nowadays being very nostalgic for 60s, 70s, and 80s particularly. And usually it's millennials and Zoomers who have got this nostalgia that they want to emulate that style, or they want to listen to that kind of music, or they want to just immerse themselves in those decades. And of course, there's the great failing of you can't perfectly emulate that time period, because we are living now in an age where the world is so fundamentally different. The internet being the immediate example. And also, I think when you try to bring up that level of nostalgia, people are not again, speaking about like 60s and 80s, you're probably romanticizing, the music, the style, the kind of films and media that were being produced at the time, you're probably forgetting things like your typical political stances there. Like, it was perfectly socially acceptable in the 60s to just call someone a fag.
Better days. Yeah, or...
When you... Sorry.
Go on.
Yeah. I was just thinking that when you mentioned, like, the millennial and Zoomer nostalgia for the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the only thing I could think of in regards to maybe why is because it was the time appeared weirdly more optimistic, I guess, in the sense of not necessarily in the political climate, but more in the style and music. Like, it was all very upbeat and bright and all these things. But then I have to wonder if it's just, well, this was a slightly less pessimistic era, because I would honestly say pessimism went on the rise as soon as the Enlightenment happened.
Well, it is worth noting that when we're talking about like really broad stroke movements or like periods such as the 60s, typically what we're talking about there, especially when it comes to the musical influences, the tastes of the hippies, really. Like, that's a lot of the time what we're talking about. And if you're stretching that out to the 70s and the 80s, then maybe you're bringing some other groups under the umbrella as well, like the rockers and the punks. But these are tiny, tiny minorities of what was actually going on at the time. And so I think that kind of goes into the idea of it not being something that is revivable in its full form, because these are very sort of minuscule parts of a much greater system. And in trying to get all nostalgic about this one particular facet, we're kind of like missing the wider picture a lot of the time. I mean, not to mention the fact that the hippies were like, a tiny part of California and maybe London and like a bunch of other capital cities or major cities. And that's it, in amongst hundreds of thousands of other people that are just kind of like getting on, much as their parents would have, and getting on with their lives, who probably hate them.
Yeah, when I feel like my brain's bouncing from point to point here, but I do find it interesting then when you take that societal level nostalgia, especially for, as you mentioned, the punk rock movement, which was very much based on rebellion, or a rebellious attitude, I suppose would be more accurate. And it makes me think of how, even though, I mean, I feel like no one here is in disagreement that currently the left holds the institutional power in the Western world.
Yeah.
That even though the left now holds this institutional power like very firmly, that they still try to see themselves as punk rock, as rebellious as these hippies. And I have to wonder, is that like their own little societal nostalgia? Like, we like to think back to the days when our movement maybe had more credibility as an underdog rebellion kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I know plenty of people, mostly met through university, who are the kind of people who would like describe themselves as being like left wingers, or like even some people who are just unironically communists, who are also very clearly nostalgic for that old kind of like 60s, 70s sort of punk rock thing, where they're trying to like portray this, they're trying to replicate this image of being like a punk who's against the societal norms and who's really rebelling against the system, while totally pulling the party line on most left-leaning policies, like immigration and views towards like LGBT community and stuff like that.
What speech is allowed, basically?
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I mean, interestingly enough, I forget his name, but the lead singer of the Sex Pistols, if you've seen anything he's been saying in recent years, he's clearly a right winger. I remember him being like really getting behind and supporting Brexit.
Yeah,
and loads of people who are, probably weren't even hadn't been born until years after the fact. Like, people who are around 20s or so today wouldn't have even been alive when Sex Pistols were big, being like, oh, I can't believe he'd say that, this is crazy, he's supposed to be, and just not being able to connect the dots and realize that they're not the rebellious ones anymore.
Yeah, another example of that would be Gavin McGuinness, who has never sort of abandoned his identity with his identifying with the sort of like punk rock sort of movement and the sub-community, but now his assertions are those naturally lead to a more like right-wing political set of proposals or like worldview, whereas obviously the de facto or like standard view of what the punk rockers were is quite different to that. with all of the like anarchy and rebellion and like that whole sort of aesthetic, as you say, that's been very closely tied to the left, but in a kind of irreverent sort of way.
I suppose the only thing I'd add is that there are multiple ways of rebelling, and one of them would be, I suppose it's not incorrect to have that sort of attitude of a rebellious youth if you're pulling the party line even further left than it already is. That's still a form of rebellion, even if it is just, I don't know, I suppose pulling things in the direction that the cultural velocity is already going in.
I would agree with you, but the point is negated by the fact that they're trying to emulate a specific kind of rebellion, that being the punks of the 60s and 70s, where their views are so diametrically opposed to what the left is today.
Yeah.
Or you could say that they're also trying to. So a lot of the social justice types are trying to very overtly cast themselves in the shadow, or cast themselves as the successors of the original civil rights movement in America, and that's kind of like a similar sort of thing where you're sort of idealizing what they were and what they were standing for, and trying to place yourself in the same kind of position. But it's not the same when the authorities are the ones that are on your side and championing you, not like sicking the dogs on you.
That was something I distinctly remember from the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening last year. Was people kept on saying that this is the biggest, or the civil rights movement in history. Just that was what I kept on hearing over and over again. And it's sort of like, well, you're not achieving even a fraction of what the civil rights protests in the 60s achieved. Like, those protests achieved like actual equality of the races. Well, actually getting people like treated equally. What you've managed to do is tear down some statues and throw bricks at a few police officers who were there to support you.
I mean, legal equality in certain ways, maybe, but other than that, I don't think they really achieved that much, especially considering it was in this same mold of just pushing harder in the direction of what most of the institutions already want. I mean, the amount of money that was behind the original civil rights movement, it's pretty astronomical, and a lot of like really big name foundations and such, and NGOs.
I feel like it just says something about the attitude of certain people when you become nostalgic for something that is predominantly quite negative to remember on, like regardless of whether you were supported or were against civil rights in any form, that time was bad for everybody. And I feel like it's such a weird desire to have that kind of societal nostalgia to perpetuate your strange victimhood complex. It's just very bizarre to me.
Well, that's partially where I was going to go with it, is that I would question which side of the nostalgia the civil rights movement is on, because I would probably suggest that in the modern people who see themselves as civil rights warriors are more in the mold of the original civil rights warriors than the people who are kind of like claiming that they're something different. But yeah, in fact, a lot of the time, the corporate entities that are behind some of these modern day civil rights movements are not even necessarily the same ones, but sometimes they are. But like that as a mold has not really changed all that much. The only difference, I suppose, is that the civil rights warriors have even more like overt government support than they did in the past, whereas it would have been a bit more of a tentative political issue in the past, at least at the state level, as far as I understand it anyway. So I think that the actual nostalgia taking place is on the part of the people who, I guess, the modern day conservatives who are trying to set apart the old civil rights warriors and say that they're okay, but the modern day ones, no, they're the ones that are being disruptive. No, they were all rioting. They were all funded by like the same corporate interests, basically, and there was all like, and in every case there was obvious people behind the people who were put up front to put a happy face on everything.
I think I don't disagree, but I do think that it's a bit. It would be wrong to say that the people who, social justice warrior types today aren't also nostalgic for the civil rights of old.
They are also nostalgic, and they view themselves in a very delusional position, but it's less delusional than the people who want to set them up, who want to set the original civil rights people up as like being something completely different from what BLM is now, for example.
Yeah.
In both cases, they had like huge corporate backing, media cover for like all of the rioting that they were doing, like an obvious situation of, as I said, one set of people up front, and then another set of people behind that are informing them on an ideological level and supporting them, but not necessarily wanting to be the face, because there's like terrorism and like actual federal terrorism, like murdering of police officers and straight up communism back there. But you don't want the public to see that.
Okay, so I guess then maybe we're looking in the wrong area of nostalgia then in this example. Maybe it's less that they're nostalgic for those aspects of the civil rights movement and more nostalgic for the battle lines, where now it is very clear, as you say, like politicians are very overt about their support. Maybe they long for the day when that support was never as overt, because then it lets them enjoy that kind of like we were the underdogs fighting against injustice, whereas now it's much harder to kind of put that spin on it.
Yeah, it's come up before, but and I couldn't remember his name last time, but the guy who's in, like, the black guy in that plays Finn in the Star Wars movies, new Star Wars movies, whatever the actor
John
is called.
Boyega.
That's him. I'm pretty sure it was you that corrected me last time as well. Anyway, him standing up in Hyde Park, I think it was, and saying, I'm probably going to get fired for this, or this is probably going to affect my career, but, I'm going to make a stand for BLM. Like, that's a very obvious self-delusion that is, and, like, maybe it's not a conscious self-delusion, but the idea that most of Hollywood thinks, or that most of Hollywood is on the other side of the issue to him, is just, like, blatantly absurd. But he still wants that, like, that special virtue of feeling as though he's, like, standing up for some, like, noble position, even though everyone else is on the wrong side of it, that he sees the truth, and stuff like that.
Right. I feel like we're getting kind of caught up on the specific example here of the left and the 60s to 80s. I feel like we should try and switch over now and think about the nostalgia that the right is always, or the right usually has for the past, and what eras it is, because I do think that's something worth us discussing here.
Yeah, definitely. But I think there is a relevant kernel here, in that it's not just one side that's getting nostalgic, despite the way that I framed it earlier on, is like everyone is to some degree nostalgic about certain things in their past, because of these the stories that we have to tell each other about our history, which are necessarily incomplete. But there's always like a political stake in telling the history in a certain way.
Definitely. I think once we cover, we can tie this all back together after we. There are some points I want to make, but I feel that they will fall flat without us talking about the right before we jump onto that.
Well, take it in the direction that you want to take it then, unless anybody else wants to like quickly jump on and make a point.
Me and the boys crossing the Rubicon at 2 a.m. looking for Imperium.
Yes, we're all very proud of that means. Right, so as far as what I'm aware, the era that the right is always nostalgic for, or at least appearing to be nostalgic for, would be usually a sort of 1950s or even pre-World War, like a pre-World War One version of the West, a version of the West that was immediately and like very powerful. They just either in the example of post-World War II had just like finished demonstrating its power and winning a intercontinental war, or in pre-war times had a very obvious power in its colonialism, where society was overall seemed to be more patriotic, and there seemed to be a more cohesive national identity about the West. That's what I always immediately go to when immediately recognize what the right is nostalgic for. Yeah,
it definitely varies by country and by sort of individual ideology, I suppose. So, normie conservatives are going to be nostalgic about a period like, the 90s, maybe the 60s or something, depending on, which generation they're from or whatever. But yeah, the broad stroke, the right tends to be nostalgic about some period in particular, but it varies which period exactly.
I feel like the difference there is that a lot of, at least the right-wing nostalgia that I've seen has been based around, I don't know how much we can say for YouTube. So things that the right doesn't like today, time periods where those weren't issues, shall we say, and be very safe.
Please, YouTube, no.
Henry, do you want me to make that ice much more thinner for you to skate on?
Yes, please. So I'll give an example of, because I suppose it's more recent, the issues of like gay marriage and things like that, whereas today it's sort of generally accepted, okay, well, it's just a thing, and the establishment and by extension most normies are in favour of it. And I think a lot of the nostalgia is just based around, okay, well, I am not in favour of this, so I preferred the time when it was not in favour. Using that as an example.
Yeah, there's probably different levels of nostalgia. So you could be nostalgic about like if a particular policy is your cup of tea, then maybe you're nostalgic about a period where, for example, I don't know, the Gilded Age in America, where there was no income tax, basically no tax that most people would come into contact with, and neither would they get in contact with the government. If you're a libertarian, then that's probably sounding like the dream.
Also, a much safer example.
Or alternatively, if you're a little bit more wide-scale materialistic, I suppose, then you're looking back at a time when, for example, you could get a job really easily. Like the whole, there's a bunch of memes about this, but the idea of the boomers and that kind of period where you could quite easily just walk down the street, hand out a bunch of resumes to like every business along the street, and like half of them would offer you a job that is of pretty substantial wage compared to modern wages, especially at the entry level. So you could look at something like that when the economy was really good or something, or you could look at the level higher than that where your country is doing really well, perhaps, and you could feel pride about like what your country was doing, what your country had achieved, and all the stuff that was happening, and it was just an exciting place to be, and it felt optimistic. And then you could probably go like one level higher than that, where you're talking about like a general spiritual milieu in which things are just sort of like the way that people think about things is much better, and you're kind of it feels more like you're on an upward trajectory, and everybody kind of seemingly has some kind of like place and a spiritual happiness and completeness that we completely lack today.
So you're saying something like,
I worry that you're conflating. Oh, sorry, go on.
All I was going to say is it's that sort of like, when you talk about things on like a thinking and spiritual level, that's the sort of thing that makes me very nostalgic for pre-Enlightenment era, just because people were a bit less depressing.
Well, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, yeah. So it's like place in society and having like meaningful relationships with all of your community around you, like, basically from cradle to grave. And the feeling that people would look out for you if you needed the help. And, not only that, but you also have like a personal relationship with God. And there is pretty much no one around that's going to attack you for that. Whereas, obviously that's not going to happen in the modern day. There's atheism everywhere, and you might get like, in fact, no, you will get mocked for like being a Christian. Perhaps less so for being a Muslim if you're, like in some kind of insular community, or, perhaps less so for being a Christian if you're in an insular Christian community, but there are a lot fewer of those than there would have been. Was there a separate point you wanted to make, Henry? And did that answer it in any way?
Well, it's less of a point and more I was worried that you're conflating. So saying that it's the same thing just being scaled up or in a slightly different situation, whereas I do feel like those are quite different forms of nostalgia.
Yeah, that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that you can have like different depths of yeah, it's kind of like it's almost like a taxonomy of nostalgia, something like that. I think that's the right word, where you're just kind of like breaking down different types. But I think that certain of these higher types, as I've structured it, or like the levels of nostalgia above other levels, are just kind of like a more all-encompassing yearning for something in particular. Because obviously something like the economy isn't doing too well is something that is a little bit more circumstantial than religion is dead in our country. Yeah,
true. Though, well, I suppose this is sort of moving on. I do feel like that, or I wonder if I should say, the nostalgia going as far back as it is, so going back to sort of pre-Enlightenment era nostalgia, I wonder if that's a more modern thing, because I feel like a lot of what we've had so far, social progress wise, has been fairly, tame and slow in comparison to what we get today.
Yes, but you have had people that have been pointing this out for a very long time. You know, the idea that, well, the god is dead. Yeah, I'm obviously drawing a comparison to Nietzsche there, and you have other people who are doing so from less of an observational and more of something that they feel rather than something that they observe. If you know what I mean there.
Yeah. So, do we think then that do we think that social progress has accelerated more recently, and do we think that that is something that would cause that nostalgia that I just discussed?
Calling it social progress is something that I would deeply disagree with, but in terms of have things been changing a lot faster in the past 10 or so years than almost any generation, full generation prior? Yeah, I'd probably agree with that.
Yeah,
as would I.
Although the best way I describe it, considering that people can see this sort of thing coming, they really can. And I know that people call it the slippery slope fallacy and everything, but it really is it's like a boulder rolling down a slight incline. It's going to be slow to start, but if it keeps going down the incline, it's going to go faster and faster
until it hits something. So
initially, its progress down the hill is going to be slow, but it is eventually going to reach a top speed. And I think that's where we're maybe at on this quote-unquote social progress.
Yeah, that would be one way of looking at it. I don't think I'd disagree.
Though I suppose that is getting a bit off topic. And I think we've talked about it before, haven't we?
Yes, probably, I think. But it kind of isn't, it isn't, because I suppose the thing is that usually when somebody is trying to raise a concern about what a certain change will mean for the social fabric of certain institutions. Let's stick with marriage because it's an easy example. The idea of making marriage, making it easier to get a divorce and just making marriage kind of all about just a legal bond between somebody that you really like or that you love even. That's quite a far cry from what marriage was, but it's sort of implied in the ease of both getting a marriage and a divorce. And so I have no doubt that at the time people were sort of raising the idea that, if you make marriage really, if you make marriage meaningless basically, then you'll have people treating marriage as meaningless, and they'll be getting divorces all the time. They'll just be completely disregarding it. And if marriage is disregarded, then you'll see a breakdown of the family. And if you see a breakdown in the family, then X, Y, and Z. I think the difference is that usually these changes have happened over multiple generations, and so the rate of change has been so slow that people could rationalize the slippery slope as a fallacy rather than it being just a logical consequence of what happens when you alter certain things in certain directions combined with normal human impulses over time.
I mean, people are generally bad at not understanding that we humans as a species are generally short-term thinkers. It's very hard to look at things over long-term and accept that long-term something negative is happening. It's why you get people who freak out about the slightest bit about climate change news in the short term when it's there's not remotely enough data to say things in the long term. You just don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the slippery slope. It's just, and how at one point that would have been considered a fallacy. It's just the slope has been slipped so often in recent years that, I mean, how long ago was it that gay marriage was legalized here in Britain?
Let's be generous and say 15 years.
Yeah, it's been about 15 years. 15 years ago, do you think that that would have been reasonable? That you could have reasonably said to yourself, okay, then now that gay marriage has been legalized, blokes are going to be allowed to go into women's bathrooms and people are going to start rationalizing pedophilia.
Well,
because if you said that 15 years ago, people would have said, you're a fucking lunatic, that's obviously not going to happen. And yet, look where we are today.
Well, okay, you could make an argument that these two things aren't necessarily connected, even though I would definitely say that they probably are connected. What about just the conversations that we're having nowadays about whether or not incest marriage is going to be legal? So a man, I think it was either a man or a woman marrying his own child, or her own child, whatever. And I believe there may have been a case on bestiality as well. Getting married to...
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Please, no more black pills.
The furries are going to be celebrating in the streets.
I might be misremembering this one, so don't quote me on it, but these are conversations that are happening. Like zoophilia is a word that I came across in the last few years of like people trying to normalize bestiality, and it's kind of hard to get to that point if you don't start off from that argument, that core argument that was being made during the gay marriage debate, where love is love. If love is love, then like, to go back to your point that I was trying to escape from, why should children be excluded from love?
This is less bull in a china shop and more like someone's throwing a fragmentation grenade into a china shop. This is such a dangerous way to go in the conversation.
Well, this
is a dangerous way for our society to go.
To go dangerously close to something we should probably stop talking about. There was a trend recently of age is just a number, talking about legal age women, just about, talking sort of 18-year-olds, going out with very much older men, using the slogan, age is just a number, not really realizing that, I don't know which came first, but that is a slogan that has been used to justify paedophilia quite often.
Yeah.
And yes, with that, we can stop talking about this topic.
Yeah. Anyway, back to the more pleasant days of the present, where this doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, we've got to finish this casual chat up quickly before the fucking YouTube Special Forces teams smash through our doors and drag us off for saying bad things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now that we've finished up our roundup of right-wing societal nostalgia, I can finally go into the point that I was trying to raise, 20-30 minutes ago.
Hold on. Just, can we appreciate the right-wing nostalgia of days when paedophilia was like unthinkable and just completely immoral without a second thought?
Stop!
And people wonder why I believe the things I believe.
Go on.
Right. So ultimately, when it comes down to societal nostalgia, it is different subcultures, whether that be left-wingers, right-wingers, people who want to call themselves punks, or protesters or whatever. Ultimately, it comes down to you want to be these people are nostalgic for periods in history where the things that their goals, the things that they believe, aligned better than they believe they currently do with the present. So the left-wingers are nostalgic for the 60s through to the 80s, where could be seen as like a simpler time where a lot of social progress was being made. People on the right are nostalgic for a pre-war Europe where right-wing policies and there were the norm. Even like a modern day conservative would be considered like rather left-leaning by a right-winger from the early 1900s. These groups want these time periods that better mesh with their own idea of how society should be, which is not entirely surprising.
Yeah, but I mean, like I said earlier, I think that a lot of the time there's a sort of grasping for something deeper than that. Like when you're talking about being nostalgic about a certain period, there's usually quite a lot of baggage with that, and that's probably one of the few things that is accurately picked up on by sort of like, I don't know, critical theory types. The idea that if you're fantasizing about the 50s, you're fantasizing about like more than just a nice aesthetic. You're fantasizing about like a place in the world and like a certain position in a certain hierarchy, maybe, or I don't know, something like that. But I think it's probably...
there's a somewhat spiritual element to it.
Yeah,
where it's more that you don't just want to live in that aesthetic. It's not just that you want to be able to go outside wearing a bowler hat without looking like a total weirdo. You want to fit into a certain mold in society that you think you would better suit than where you currently are. And it's all whenever anyone is nostalgic for the past, it is always a romanticized version of the past. When the left are thinking of or not even necessarily the left, when people are thinking of like the 80s, they're remembering the big shoulder pads and the music and the culture. They're not remembering things like casual racism. And when the right is remembering a pre-war Europe, they're remembering national unity and national strength, national pride, but not necessarily remembering
Eugenics.
or, the fact that you most certainly are not going to be able to watch, as much Japanese porn as you like.
Are we just trying to slice ourselves on the edge here?
I mean, what's the point in trying to avoid it now? We're like, 50 minutes in?
Yeah, I mean, we've already talked about paedophilia. I don't think bringing up porn is going to make it any worse. Anyway, on that happy note, I would encourage you all to indulge in some nostalgia for the better days before you came upon this YouTube video.
This really didn't go where I was expecting it to.
No, I suppose
I am really, really sorry that it went this way.
Well, I mean,
This is what happens when we take breaks.
We've barely scratched the surface of this subject. I could definitely talk about it a lot more, and it didn't go in the direction that I thought it would either. So for once, I'm going to encourage everyone to go and share their thoughts on their thoughts on social nostalgia and what came to mind from any of the particular topics that we brought up. Go and talk about that down in the comments.
And while you're there, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
And ding that bell. See you next time.